Is it on? Okay. Okay. Okay, thank you very much for reconvening and coming together again tonight to continue with the last session in today's program. I'd like to thank Nikita Dhawan, and I'm sure the rest of my panelists as well, and her colleagues who are hosting the Symposium series, as well as Judith Weber, who's ensured that we've been here and arrived here comfortably, for inviting us. My name is Rirhandu Mageza-Barthel, and I'll be moderating the session tonight. To the right of me, we have Yala. Next to her, we have Rolando. And on the farthest side from me, we have Nadje. The current panel was given the title Hope, which in the context of colonial repercussions only appears plausible when brought together with an idea of utopia. When considering that as academics, we're more often than not trained to offer critiques of past and current developments, lest we sound uncritical, then hope is something we do too seldomly, and is something that we hardly ever project our ideas towards. It is elusive, and often it's short-lived. In particular, for post-colonial scholars who deconstruct and trace colonial incursions and violations, this is a challenge. This is not just the case owing to the subject matter and approaches we have chosen to analyze our material with. When we look around us and take experience into account, or even when we refer to current events, they would suggest that the world is contested, hostile, and at times uninhabitable. But when we do take up such a topic as hope, I would claim that we do it in a more deliberate manner and also possibly in a more nuanced manner. Hope is intimately tied to and thrives on imagination, and so this panel takes up some of the issues raised during the symposium, such as universities as spaces or sites of resistance, feminisms, wider claims to justice, and strategies to mobilize and organize, among a few. We have a panel of international scholars from different fields. We have philosophy, anthropology, and sociology, who are respectively based in France, the United Kingdom, and the Netherlands, and who are also prolific authors. So beyond what you will hear from me about them today, I would like to invite you to visit their websites or your respective catalogs to find out more. What does unify them, in spite of their varied backgrounds and topics, seems to be their interest in and their purpose as scholar activists, about which you will hear with reference to migration, to gender, and the environment. So in the next 2 hours, we will proceed as follows. Each speaker gets a chance to present an opening, lengthy statement concerning their thoughts on the topic of hope, and following an initial discussion, we will then take questions from the audience. So please allow me to introduce the speakers in brief detail to you. I'm going to start off on the far side. Nadia Al-Ali is Professor of Gender Studies at SOAS in London, at the University of London, and her research interests revolve around gender theory and feminist activism, transnational migration and diaspora mobilization, and war, conflict, and transformation. For today, I'd just like to highlight 2 publications of hers, which also deal with the regional expertise in the Middle East. The one is Iraqi Women, Untold Stories from 1948 to the Present, which appeared in 2007 with Z Books, and her edited book, We Are Iraqis, Aesthetics and Politics in Time of War, which appeared in 2012 with Syracuse University Press. And this co-edited book also won the 2014 Arab American Book Prize for Nonfiction. Next to her, we have Rolando Vázquez, who's Associate Professor of Sociology at the University College Roosevelt and is also affiliated with the Research Institute for Cultural Inquiry and the Gender Studies Department at Utrecht University. With Walter Mignolo, he has coordinated the Middelburg Decolonial Summer School, and he belongs to the movement of decolonial aesthesis and thought. With his research, in which precedence and temporalities feature as an ongoing theme, he aims to contribute to decolonizing institutions, epistemology, aesthetics, and subjectivity. In a certain way, he kind of represents also this crossover between cultural practice and academia, Last year, he curated a workshop at the Berliner Festspiele. And if I were to name some of his publications, I'm only going to maybe name something in English. Others have been written in Spanish, for instance. He's written on the coloniality of gender as a radical critique of developmentalism in the Palgrave Handbook of Gender and Development, edited by Wendy Harcourt. And he's also the co-author of the 2016 report of the Diversity Commission at the University of Amsterdam with Gloria Wecker and colleagues. The final person that I'd like to introduce is Yala, who is associate professor at the University Paris 8, Vincennes Saint-Denis. And she was previously the vice chair of the Collège International de Philosophie in Paris. And her work concentrates on French continental philosophy, religion, and Africana philosophy. And this interest is mirrored in her publications, amongst them Henry Bergson or Creative Humanity, or topics such as nostalgia and post-colonial utopia in Senghor's Négritude, or philosophy as an anthropological object. So to outline the topics that we will be touching on today, they encompass weighing the possibilities of conceiving and articulating hope against the backdrop of multiple crises and inequalities, understanding the friction caused by legacies of European Enlightenment, and the impact of norms of freedom, justice, rights, and democracy in processes of decolonization. The order that we'll have the presentations in are going to be Yala will start, then Nadia will follow, and in closing, Rolando will present his paper. Thank you. Yala, the floor is yours.
Hi, hello. I'm very happy to be here, and thank you to Nikita Dawan and Judith Weber for this invitation, and I'm very happy to be part of such a stimulating discussion. Oh, sorry, I already made it. Yeah. So this is the title of my lecture, and I will read my paper just because this is English, and I'm French. So the aim of this lecture is to try to understand what could be or what can be a decolonization of Europe today. Okay, I can already see your bored and suspicious gazes. The decolonization of Europe, perhaps nothing more than a repetitive slogan that has no material or concrete effect in our everyday lives. But through this lecture, I would like to emphasize a way to undermine a type of theoretical melancholia that sometimes shapes epistemic decolonizing practices rooted in Africana contemporary theory. And this is what I would like to call Laetitia Africana. But to explain this expression, I would love to start this lecture with a story, and unfortunately not a story of hope, but a story of defeat. That has nothing to do with this panel. I'm sorry about that. So there were a lot of protests in France this last month, protests that still continue against the destruction of the public services in hospitals, public transports, universities that are all public. But among those protests, many people gathered against a law that has been ratified by the National Assembly the 22nd of April this year, and that is now discussed by the Senate until June 26. The purpose of this law, called Loi Asile et Immigration, is, in the wording of the legislator, to control the migratory flows and to create concrete conditions to apply a real asylum policy. The spirit of this law could be summarized quickly. A right to asylum is not a right to immigration. Through the question of asylum, what is at stake is the strengthening of the laws against immigration, the immigration from Africa and the immigration from Middle East. The protest against this law took one peculiar form. A university, my university, Paris 8, Vincennes Saint-Denis, became a shelter for refugees. Here you can see a survival blanket that was designed by activists saying you can't judge a university by its international prestige, but by the struggles people are doing in it. So One morning of early February, new inhabitants from Sudan, Eritrea, Ethiopia took the academic community by surprise and occupied an entire building of the university. They are still there. To be frank, this occupation is torn between many political options that are completely conflictual, but I won't emphasize them here. It's not the moment, I think. Because the utopic orientation of this occupation is very deep and strong. It transforms the academic freedom, described by Jacques Derrida as an unconditional freedom of questioning and of creating. It transforms it into an unconditional principle of hospitality for all the lives, bodies, sensitive intelligences of this world. But what is interesting is how this incredible movement of 5 months, 6 months now, was described in the national press and how it was interpreted. Despite the historical dimension of this occupation, the presidents of the university did not call the police to push the migrants away. So despite this historical dimension of this occupation, it remained non-visible at all, except 3-4 articles in the Figaro, Libération, and the last one yesterday in Le Monde. And this struggle was magically erased. Of course, we could say, perhaps, that public opinions in general on this side of the earth, I mean Europe, have become indifferent to the fate of the refugees for many reasons: terrorism, conditions of living becoming more and more precarious in Europe itself. But this process of erasure, of invisibilization, has also something to do with the question of the territory and the relationship between France, its own past, its own post-colonial immigration. The University Paris 8 is usually a target of the alt-right in France for 2 main reasons. First, it is rooted in a long tradition of radical critical theory, embodied by the legacy of Vincennes, Foucault, Deleuze, Badiou, Rancière, Kristeva, Sixou, etc. Paris 8 is seen, yeah. Okay. We all love them, okay? I do. Paris 8 so is seen as a shelter for all the radical leftists of the Akademie, and just a little note, the alt-right and many groups very conservative have launched a kind of cartography of the intellectual in France that are supporting, I mean, the leftist ideas and that are fighting against Islamophobia. And 3 academies of my country were in this cartography: le HESS, École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, the University Nanterre, and my university. And they are targeting some scholars. So, and the second reason, which is more important, is that the campus is located in the Parisian suburb, in a wonderful city called Saint-Denis. Saint-Denis, where many foreign people coming from all parts of Africa, especially from the ancient French colonies, live. So you can understand that the public image of the city of Saint-Denis, that is an embodiment of a long story of African post-colonial immigration, is that it is a place of France where France has lost itself, a French place that is not French anymore for the public image of this city. In this case, the erasure of the struggle can appear quite clear. The cartography and the logic of the territory invalidate the policy of asylum. A territory inhabited by humans considered as waste is essentially made for waste humans. I take the expression waste humans from Achille Mbembe, déchets d'hommes in French. So the process of disparition of this struggle that took place in Paris 8 is based on a simple logic rule: the same attracts the same. In this process of erasure, the political acts of activists and of an academic community are naturalized and seen consubstantial to the supposed essence of the territory where they take place. Blacks are here for blacks, Arabs are here for Arabs, Muslims are here for Muslims. So this process of erasure cannot be understood through an ethical understanding of the duality between the visible and the invisible. It has to do with the question of race, or more precisely, the principle of race that gains the structures of Western liberal democracy today. in this principle of race, race functions as an original, material, and phantasmatic category, to quote Bembe, that structures the hierarchies and the organization of the power in the society. The ethics of the face-to-face, you know, people are responsible to one another in the face-to-face encounter, in the wording of Levinas, is ruined by the racial construction of features, veil, color of the skin, language, religion, racial construction of features that undermine any possibility to feel responsible to people who are racially profiled. This dark intrication of the principle of race and colonial legacy that arises today from racialized imaginaries, post-colonial melancholias, and immigration policies, usually targeting people from African descent, allows us to understand many contemporary policies of liberal European countries under the scheme of the colonial relation. Colonial relation is not understood here in a metaphorical sense, neither as a totalizing process that would make unclear where processes of decolonization would emerge from, but as a contemporary way to reinforce racial, gendered hierarchies inherited from the structuration of the power in the past colonial world. So the contemporary project of decolonizing Europe emerges from this precise context, not as a slogan, but as a way to undermine policies reenacting the principle of race inherited from a certain history of colonialism. I had another picture. I like this one. There are faults, I mean, when they wrote, but they are just, the students did these posters in the university. There are many. I mean, the university looks like a squat now, you say that? But you can love this kind of aesthetic. But I don't know if you understand the French, but it says the university is closed for the private interest, for the bank, finance, but it's open to people who are refugees or who are in exile. So how could we understand, and this will be the more theoretical part of this paper, it's a very short part. How could we understand concretely the way to decolonize Europe without doing a kind of slogan, quite cool, but with no material effect? I would love to recall some voices in the Africana contemporary theory that could help us to understand how we could think the process of decolonizing Europe. In this groundbreaking book, that is an author which is really important, the Muntu Crisis, launched in 1977, Fabien Ebossi-Boulaga tries to deconstruct the forms taken by philosophy in African universities and intellectual work after the independence. The core of this book, the Muntu Crisis, is based on one important question: how to make an other's language one's own. And it's interesting because I think it's not Boulaga is not in the path of Walter Mignolo, for example, because for him the question of decolonization has nothing to do with the problem of the rejection or even the disobedience, but with the problem of reappropriation. How to reappropriate ourselves, but how to reappropriate what came from the others. The question of decolonization is based on a dialectical process of reappropriation. So, in his political and cultural sense, the process of decolonization has to face two pitfalls. First, the nativist temptation, fascinated by origins, purity, and roots, another spectrum of the war of civilization. And the mimetic temptation, we could call that alienation if you want to, repeating the colonial Eurocentric erasure of African realities, that is to say, a validation of the colonial relation. And what says Boulaga? To avoid those pitfalls, one must engage in a discussion dealing with what a tradition is. Boulaga shows that a certain use of tradition, understood as the whole set of mores, customs that are transmitted, can be reclaimed as part of an emancipatory process that avoids nativism and alienation. And tradition has to be used and understood in three ways. First, tradition as a vigilant memory. Politics of memory are not politics of victimhoods. Second, tradition as critical identification. Self-identity is a contextualized narration and is always historical. It is never given and always recreated by what comes from the other. In this case, there is not something like a pure African tradition, neither a pure European tradition. And more important, the third sense, tradition as an utopian model. What does that mean? Tradition becomes future-oriented if it has criticized the present, and it presents us with the project of another world, which is characterized by other types of human relations, where property, labor, culture will be experienced differently in a way that is not disintegrated and that does not disintegrate people. Tradition can be used to enable imagination, that is to say, to reinvent the rules of the social order. So, the concept of tradition, according to Bulaga, has nothing to do with the conservative idea of roots. The past is not an essence and does not bear truth. Tradition is the witness of an historical process. The plurality of African and European traditions have been reshaped through colonization and decolonization. There is no white Europe, as there is no black Africa. South lives in the North, and North lives in the South. And reinterpreted through Bulaga's thought, the decolonization practice has one objective: to create the conditions of a concrete utopian consciousness that reinvents the rules of the social order. So to conclude, the decolonization practice cannot be exclusively identified with a commemorative practice, a practice reminding constantly the injury inflicted to ancient colonized people, and a practice whose purpose would only be critical, that is to say, destroying the hoaxes and mystifications of the grand narratives of the modernity. Judith Butler and Athena Athanasiou have shown how the subjects inflicted of violence are open subjects living in a world that does not support them. So the aim of the decolonizing process will be to create a supporting world, and in our case, an idea of Europe definitely cleansed of its imperial and racial nostalgies, so able to wonder in a non-colonial way how to make another's language one's own. Practices of decolonization attempt to break with a certain melancholia. The affective experience of melancholia is rooted in memories of loss and defeat. Melancholic states of mind remain often linked to decolonizing practices that recall stories of loss. The risk of such a recall is to transform surreptitiously a historical situation of defeat into an ontology. This transformation confines the decolonizing gesture in a repetitive and critical project. Words, 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 I'm sorry, only words. And I was trying to say something very concrete, very material. So let's come back just for those last words in my university. So this is when you enter, you have the gates that are horrible, it's true. And behind, you have a lot of pictures made by artists, photographies, with people living in the Saint-Denis or Aubervilliers suburbs. And I love, because this picture was taken behind the gates, and you see this little girl with this T-shirt, love. So all those questions of decolonizing Europe, being able just to create another version of Europe, trying to change the rule of the social order, is this only word? Not really. What happened in the university Paris 8, becoming a refuge, is a material example of an act of decolonization of France in France, where the political path of a European country was redesigned during 6 months by new solidarities between African refugees, professors, activists, and students at the borders of Paris. An article launched yesterday in the French newspaper Le Monde has shown how the multiple struggles of this year left a scar on the face of the university. Graffitis, destructions, divisions inside the academic community, and of course, weariness. So the last step of the colonization practice becomes now, as we can understand, a real question of political strategies, so how to build struggles able to enter and creep from the margins to the center. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Yala. As the next speaker, we're going to have Nadia.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I'm going to stand and wait for my PowerPoint. But while I'm waiting, so I decided to, I could have said a lot about Europe and the UK and Germany, but I decided that as part of the project of decolonizing Europe, I'm actually going to focus on Iraq, or rather the specific challenges that I've been facing over the past 15 years or so, both as an academic and as an activist, working on Iraq and working with Iraqi feminists. And so I'm going to share some of these challenges with you. And I think, as we sort of heard previously, although I am going to say something about the present and the future, and I hopefully get to hope, it is very clear that also in the Iraqi context, in order to overcome the very extremely disillusioned present, it is important to engage initially with the past. And so I am going to start with the past here and sharing a picture that I like a lot. It was taken in 1948 in Baghdad, and 1948 signifies the beginning of what in Arabic is called al-Wathba, or the leap. And it was 10 years of revolutionary movement against the Iraqi monarchy and against British meddling in Iraq. And I particularly like the image because it shows you that at the time, 1948, women were part of these protests. And you might not see so well the banner, but the banner actually professes to Arab and Kurdish unity against British meddling in Iraq. So it always gives me hope showing this image. Now, but going to some of the challenges is one of the big challenges that I'm facing is to speak about Iraq without falling into the trap of a kind of linear modernist accounts of modernity and development. So this is, of course, a very shocking image. When I show this image to Iraqis, they often say, this was not taken in Iraq. This is not something that especially the older generation of Iraqis associate with Iraqi tradition or the past. This is a post-invasion picture. It's been taken, it's part of the Sadrist movement, the movement linked to Muqtada as-Sadr, and this is linked to a specific ritual. So I don't want you to sort of go away and think, oh, this is how Iraqi women look like. I mean, this is at a given specific time, a specific group of Shia Islamist women are wearing this. And I should say that mostly when I give talks on Iraq, I'm not showing this image because I know exactly what it does to my audience. It just reinforces certain stereotypes. People go away and think, oh my God, these are the poor women in Iraq. But I decided to take a risk with you this evening, and I hope that you are nuanced and mature enough to not go away thinking this. Now, the second challenge that I'm facing, and not just myself, I mean, that's many of us who have been involved either academically or as activists in sort of feminist activism linked to the Middle East. The second challenge is the idea that feminism emerged in the West and that it's something imposed on women in the region. And already in the 1990s, when at the time I was living in Cairo and I was doing my PhD research on the Egyptian women's movement, I was actually struck by one activist who, when confronted with the question about the relationship to Western feminism, said, what do I need Western feminists for? I mean, I don't need 200 women from the West to tell me what feminism is. I can go back to a long history of feminist activism in my country. And the same is true in the Iraqi context. The Iraqi feminists that I've talked to, especially of the older generation, but also the younger generation, are quite proud of their history. This is a picture of Al-Rabitat al-Mar al-Iraqiyya. This is the Iraqi Women's League marching through Baghdad on International Women's Day, 1964. And I was very privileged. I was able to speak to most of the women in the front row because they ended up in exile in the UK. They were part of the Communist Party, most of them. And feminist activism really emerged in Iraq since the beginning of the 20th century, but was at the height in the 1950s and 60s. During the Ba'ath regime, there was no independent feminist activism, but it re-emerged again after 2003. Now, moving to the more recent history of Iraq, that is the history of the Ba'ath regime from 1968 to 2003, and 25 years of those years were under the presidency of Saddam Hussein. My big challenge has been how to talk about a brutal dictatorship that was popped up and supported by various countries in the West, including Germany, actually, without dismissing some of the, well, I guess sort of positive, in the voices of the women I interviewed, some of the reformist and modernist policies that the state put in place, especially in the first decade. And here I have to say I found it very difficult in terms of maneuvering the political tensions. So I give you an example. In the 90s, when Iraq was under sanctions, so for 13 years, Iraq experienced one of the most comprehensive sanctions systems ever imposed on a country. Many of the anti-sanctions activists in the UK and also in Germany were focusing on the horrible, of course, British policy, US policy, and how it was devastating in Iraq. But no one amongst, or very few amongst those activists, were speaking about the atrocities of the regime by Saddam Hussein. So actually a group of us Iraqi women based in London, we started an organization called Act Together, Women's Action on Iraq, where we're challenging British and US policies on Iraq, but we're also trying to raise awareness about the human rights atrocities at the hand of the regime. And I'll show you another. This is an iconic image that was taken in 1978. And at that time, the Iraqi government actually received a prize from UNESCO for being the country that raised the literacy of girls most rapidly. And this is because Iraq was a dictatorship with money and that decided that in order to increase human resources after the oil boom in the early 70s, the best way was to educate women. And so all women between the ages of 15 and 65 were actually forced to go through these literacy classes. And at the time, UNESCO actually gave a prize to Iraq. I think they're quite embarrassed about it now. Now, the idea that it is because of their culture, it is because of their religion. So, in other words, it's because they're Iraqi, it's because they're Muslim, it's because they're Middle Eastern, that their women are oppressed, has been something that has, or writing against this idea of the culturalization of gender-based violence, conservative gender norms, gender-based inequalities, has very much informed my writing for many years. So writing against this culturalization discourse. And so I spent quite a bit of time, especially in the early years after 2003, focusing on the impact of the invasion, of the occupation, showing not only that the invasion and occupation was complicit in furthering gender-based inequalities and gender-based violence, but they're often active perpetrators in it. Aside from, being active perpetrators, what we also saw was the instrumentalization of women. So this was maybe not as strong as in the context of Afghanistan. You're familiar with the discourse around liberating women, but women were used both. Particularly in the first year or two after the invasion, to show this is a new Iraq, we have brought democracy and human rights. And many Iraqis have been very critical of this, and this is a picture, a self-portrait of the Palestinian Iraqi artist Sam al-Shaibi, who is amongst many Iraqi artists or those with Iraqi origin, who have used art and creativity to challenge some of these hegemonic narratives about bringing democracy and human rights. But now it gets more tricky, because after years and years of me trying to challenge this culture discourse, I found that the last few years, many of my colleagues kept stressing that we can explain Iraq today by reference to the invasion and the occupation. And I started to feel really uncomfortable, because I thought, no, there are other things happening. yes, we should not essentialize culture, we should not fall into Islamophobic and racist discourse, but there are clearly local and regional factors that account for the mess we're in today. You cannot blame it all on neocolonialism, imperialism, Zionism, neoliberalism, but there are Iraqi politicians, Iraqi militias, Iraqi tribal leaders, Iraqi also religious leaders who have been, if not, have been complicit and active perpetrators. And so, you know, we have had Iraqi militants, secular and religious. We have had Iraqi politicians, many of them who had been based outside Iraq for 10, 20, 30 years. This is Nur al-Maliki, who really engaged again in authoritarianism and militarism. And so I found myself actually at odds with some of my colleagues, and I guess these are sort of mainly post-colonial feminists based in the United States, who are always focusing on the impact of US policy, but are not looking, in my view, carefully enough at what is happening locally and regionally. And of course, I am aware that whatever is happening locally and regionally is entangled with neocolonial and imperialist policies, but they cannot be reduced or conflated with them. And then, you know, for many years, as I was speaking about Iraqi women, gender-based violence, no one was interested. I mean, policymakers were not interested, the media were not interested, maybe some academic circles were interested. Now, in 2014, Daesh appeared on the scene, and all of a sudden, people were interested. And I in no way want to diminish the terrible atrocities that Daesh has been involved in, but they did not emerge in a vacuum, right? For years, that we have had Islamist militants, Sunni and Shia, which were supported by the occupation. They turned a blind eye, and no one actually dared. As one US general said, when confronted by a group of Iraqi feminists, he said, "What can we do? We don't do women." Okay. Now, how then do I speak about this range of different forms of structural inequalities and forms of oppression without falling back into this mode of women as passive victims? I don't want to do that. At the same time, I also think that we went through a phase of glorifying agency, looking for agency everywhere. So this is a big challenge. But Iraqi women clearly have not been passive victims. They have been at the forefront not only of gender-based mobilization around gender-based inequalities and gender-based justice, but actually Iraqi women have been at the forefront of challenging the increasing authoritarianism and also sectarianism, as well as corruption in Iraq. And also, you know, Iraqi women are there engaging in all kinds of, you know, in the arts, in culture. There's actually a big, there are different initiatives by young women who are fed up with politics and are turning more towards art and culture. You know, Iraqi women are following their everyday lives and aspirations. This often involves families. They're dreaming of education. I'm working with a number of Iraqi women who really would like to learn from the women in the region, in Palestine, in Egypt, Lebanon, and Turkey, who have started women and gender studies. And so they're very interested in these exchanges with other women, especially also there are lots of exchanges with Palestinian women. And I also think that it's really important. There has been this period where it seemed that the only visible Muslim woman is the pious woman. And although, you know, I think that religion plays an important role and we should not dismiss it, but religion is not the only factor that's circumscribing people's lives. Finally, I want to say something about men. We have to speak about men. So And finally, this is where a bit of hope comes in. And here is also where I want to bring it back to Germany. So of course, on the one hand, men are the problem, clearly. And men are perpetrators of violence. They are the militia. They are the main corrupt politicians. They are the ones who are interpreting religion in, very, very aggressive, conservative ways. But increasingly, men, especially I would say young men in the region, are starting to realize that if they want to change society, if they want to struggle against authoritarianism, if they want to struggle against corrupt politicians, then gender-based justice and gender-based violence is not a side issue. That is a big shift, and we've seen it in Egypt, we've seen it in Turkey, and I also see it increasingly in Iraq, where young men are starting to realize that the struggle for gender-based justice is at the heart for the struggle to greater justice overall and also against political authoritarianism. And I don't want to sort of glorify this. Of course, men are also the ones who are involved in harassing women and violating women. But when I hear the stories about the way that the discussion goes in Germany, I have to say I feel very, very upset. So, of course, I followed closely the discussion about, I don't know, maybe some of you who are not familiar with the German scene. So a young woman, I think she was 14 years old, German, was recently killed by an Iraqi Kurdish failed asylum seeker. And this sort of triggered this whole debate about I think there was one feminist ethnographer, German ethnographer, who spoke about sort of those men coming from patriarchal societies, and that's not the only case. And yes, of course, these men are coming from patriarchal societies. But I mean, first of all, don't tell me that Germany is not a patriarchal society. Secondly, yes, but in these patriarchal societies, which are everywhere, so in the Middle East, these issues are contested. I mean, this is something that men and women are engaged in contestations about. And to generalize, I mean, I think it's also wrong to try to sweep it under the carpet in the name of fighting against Islamophobia and racism. I think that is very wrong as well, and I don't agree. But I could see my first reaction was that's what I wanted to do, because I was so overwhelmed by the wave of racism and Islamophobia that I saw in the German media that it was a kind of knee-jerk reaction. But I think we should try to shy away from that, which brings me to my conclusion. So the question that I was asked to reflect on was, against whom should we direct our post-colonial critique? What should the grammar be? So first of all, I think that what I've learned over the years is that a dose of humility is good. I mean, I used to be much more sure and certain about things, and now I feel much more unsure, and I think that's okay. It doesn't mean you're wishy-washy. I mean, I think it's still important to take, political positions, but sometimes it's okay to say, well, I'm not sure. Secondly, I think it's really important to recognize positionality. Of course, my feminist colleagues and friends in Iraq, the points that they stress will be different from the ones that I stress being based in London, or that, you being based in Berlin, or someone based in New York. And again, I also would not want to generalize Berlin, London, and New York. There are different kinds of struggles, and I think we need to recognize that we might not all use the same grammar, although, we might want the same thing at the end. Really importantly, I found in the context of my work and activism, it's so important to be nuanced, to not fall into the trap of either or. And in terms of the issue of hope, I mean, this might sound totally cliche, but when I speak to Iraqi feminists, or also Kurdish feminists for that matter, or Turkish feminists, and I ask them, how do you cope? How do you manage? And they said, we don't have a choice. We need to have hope, because otherwise, what should we do? So I think that Myself, I find sources of hope that the feminist activists in Iraq and elsewhere in the region are at the forefront of challenging political authoritarianism, sectarianism, corruption, as well as different forms of gender-based violence and inequalities. And I have to admit, I probably would not have thought that I would have said it a few years ago, but I also find some hope in some men, especially younger men in the region. And I think that what I would like to see, though, here in this country, in Germany, is that the way that the debate goes around patriarchy, that you really, find more nuanced ways to talk about patriarchy and sort of challenge the idea that Germany is not a patriarchal society. Thank you.
Please come through. Yeah, I think he's okay, we're still getting comfortable again after having rearranged ourselves a bit. But the final paper will be by Rolando Vázquez.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for being here after the long day. Thank you to Nikita and Judith for inviting and organizing. Well, it's the last talk of the day, so I will try to be clear and gentle, I hope. Maybe that's the hope I have today. Well, we were invited by Nikita to think on hope and how it relates to the economic, social, and political inequalities, and I would add to the devastation of Earth. And this brings me, I think, the situation in which we are in terms of inequalities and the devastation of Earth carries what I call the ethical question, which has been, for me, the ground of my reflections in the last few years. It is a difficult question that has no ready-made answer, so I will not answer it, but I will pose the question. It is the question of the possibility, or rather the impossibility, of living an ethical life in a world in which our sense of well-being, of achievement, of many of our desires and pleasures are dependent on the suffering of others, distant and proximate others, and on the depletion of Earth, the wasting away of the body of the Earth. This, I think, is a key question for me that we are all facing when I teach in my classroom. The students that are 20 years old, they are facing this question, facing the impossibility of living an ethical life. Because our well-being, all our clothes, all our electronics, all our foodstuff is implicated in the suffering of others. We are consuming the life of others and the life of Earth. And so we cannot be in a pure position. As our friend Maria Lugones says, we are all implicated. And I think we have to face this question in order to undo the fiction of identity, of being in a position of purity, and to begin having more grounded reflections and a more grounded engagement. So from this question that recognizes our implication in the suffering of others and the depletion of Earth, or the wasting away of Earth, I would like to, in the analysis of decoloniality, which is where I come from, it is for us not just a fortuitous situation that is coming out of the development of humanity, right? It's not a necessity, a historical necessity, but it is the result of a dominant model of civilization, the dominant model of civilization of the last 500 years, which is what we call modernity, and that has established the modern colonial order. This model of civilization is we say it's monocultural in kind because it is Eurocentric in its genealogy. We can trace where it comes from and what are its principles that they are still ongoing. And it is anthropocentric in kind in its relation to Earth. It is monocultural and Eurocentric in kind. What this implies is that it is a model of civilization that has devastated other worlds, other life worlds, that has discredited them, that has silenced them, and often committed genocide against these other worlds. So it has been producing what we call the colonial difference. It is a model of civilization that, by presenting itself as a real, builds an outside that is outside the colonial difference. In its being anthropocentric in kind, it is the expression of a civilization that has put the human at the center of the world, and that has arrogated the human with the right to consume Earth. It is a very unique way of thinking. Many other civilizations cannot think of Earth as property. They cannot think of land as property. They cannot think of food as a commodity. It is a very particular form of humanism that is operating in this devastation of the Earth. So from here, I would like to speak about the decolonial path, or the decolonial path of intervention, which is what we do in the face of this, how the decolonial moves against the grain of this Eurocentric and anthropocentric model of civilization, and why the decolonial poses this question of not wanting to be modern. Because for the decolonial, modernity is co-implicated with coloniality. To be modern implies that you are reproducing this suffering and this devastation. So we are not struggling to claim modernity for ourselves or to transform modernity. We don't want to be modern in that sense. The decolonial path, I will speak of 3 steps if I have the time. The first step is the humbling of what I have been calling the humbling of modernity. And this is the condition of possibility for the second step. I mean, they are not in a linear temporality, but they do correlate in specific ways. The first step, the humbling of modernity. Second step, listening, or the movement of critique as listening. Already David this morning was hinting towards that. And the third is sensing and doing, enacting a different life, what we might call a decolonial living, but you don't need to put the adjective decolonial. So for the humbling of modernity, this is something that is very important for us. It challenges, first, the universal validity claims of modernity that have also been challenged by the internal critique of modernity. It also challenges the geopolitics of knowledge that builds modernity as a locus of enunciation and that discredits all other knowledges, as if there was no philosophies outside the genealogy of Greece and Rome, as if there was no knowledge in vernacular traditions all over the world. So the humbling of modernity has this necessary step of bringing modernity to size and demarcating its territoriality, its epistemic territoriality. So modernity has expanded itself across the globe and has touched everybody on Earth, but it is a particular epistemic territory, a particular claim to truth or to a series of truths, and especially a claim to the real. Modernity will be holding the power of producing the world by, for example, controlling the naming of the world. One of the things that colonialism did is to rename all the territories, for example, to rename the peoples, right? This is its power over reality. The control of what appears, and also the material control over the territory and the bodies and the species through strategies of classification, through sciences that have been produced for that. The other, I was saying, is that once we have the humbling of modernity, then we can begin understanding that there is an outside of that epistemic territory, and that there are many voices and many genealogies of thought that do not belong to the West. Doesn't mean that the people of the world have not been touched by modernity or that they don't have a phone. It means they have vocabularies and ways of thinking and ways of naming that cannot be subsumed under the epistemic territory of modernity. Nikita this morning was speaking about the notions of time in Urdu in China. If I have the time, I will speak about the question of time and how important it is to listen to the outside of modernity. So this poses the question of critique. The tradition of critique in the West has been a sort of a practice of an arrogant ignorance, because it has been praising its self-reflexivity, right? The movement of self-reflexivity. And I often say that if you go to the psychoanalyst and you say that you only know yourself through yourself, the psychoanalyst immediately will know you are very ignorant about yourself. Right? So when you are enclosed in an epistemic territory and there is no intercultural exchange, right, then you become an ignorant about yourself. So it is what we call, when we say Eurocentrism is a form of arrogant ignorance, right? So critique has played a part in that. And what we posit is the possibility of thinking the verbality of listening as the essential movement of critique. How can I listen to what is beyond my framework of intelligibility, right? Not just how I think through my framework and how sophisticated meta-thinking can I do, but how can I listen and recognize that I don't know, right? That recognize that there is an outside that I cannot possibly know, right? This is the humbling that could enable, and a humbling that in our methodology is very connected to one of the essential tools is positionality. So if I have time, I speak a little bit, or maybe in the conversation, about what we call an intersectional and decolonial positionality. So positionality is not just to name yourself in terms of how the state or the system names you, or your passport, right? Or the system of classification. But intersectionality, a decolonial positionality has to do with understanding your place in the colonial difference and speaking from a grounded knowledge, right? Where a performative speaking is not possible without that grounding. It's not just a privilege. Performativity would not just be a privilege of those that can access spaces of visibility or mobility, but it would only be possible through a grounded experience. For example, David was speaking this morning of the experience of enslavement. That is not a discourse. It's not, you cannot deny it as a choice, right? It's a grounded experience. For example, the Middle Passage, the genocide in the Americas, the destitution. This is the grounded experience from which you have to locate yourself, right? And where you have to define what is privilege, where is your position of speaking, who is speaking, right? So humbling, listening, critical listening, and then this sensing, doing, delinking, that is challenging for us, it is a way of challenging the reduction of experience. We understand the modern colonial order as an order that reduces experience because it separates the self from the communal and from the other worlds through systems of gender, of individualism, through Eurocentrism. It separates the self from Earth in this anthropocentric logic, and it separates the self from deep time, from lived experiences, with strategies as contemporaneity. That's why in the arts we are currently working a lot on calling for the end of the contemporary, because it's one of the powerful systems to separate people and enclose them in the surface of representation. So the movement of hope for us has to do with remembering ourselves as embodied in the precedence of earth and the communal. And this leads us to the recovery of the freedom of being in relation, of overcoming indolence and oblivion, the freedom of reclaiming the possibility of compassion, mourning, and joy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think I particularly enjoyed all three presentations, and I know that they spoke to, that there were very different papers in their essence that touched on different approaches and perspectives at the moment. Perhaps instead of a summary, which I'm not going to attempt at this stage, I might just try and kick off the discussion with a question, right? And partially, for some of you, it might be an elaboration of where you left off, and for others, it might actually be touching on something you hadn't mentioned. So I think the critical question, if we're looking at questions of hope and how you have portrayed the different contexts and settings that you've been working at or working in or looking at, one of the things that always comes to the foreground is this question of inequalities, right? And these are very often multiple and reinforcing. And if utopia is summed up as the absence of such inequalities, which can be approached but never realized, then the question would be, what indications do you have that it is worthwhile to hold out hope, right? Or when do you know that you've gotten a step closer? The floor is yours.
Take the question.
Can you repeat the question, please?
Sure. What indications do you have that it's worthwhile to hope, right? Like, if hope is something, I mean, I think it's also very indicative of the situation that we ended the panel on a rather heavy topic, right? Because that's what we're used to doing. We're used to understanding and taking things apart in a way that we say we take inequality seriously, and that's not a joyous topic, right? That's nothing anybody would like to celebrate in any manner if necessary. But if you're going to have hope, right, what kind of indications do you have that it is worthwhile hoping, right?
I can say something, but I just spoke, so okay. Well, I would like first to disengage hope from utopia. Because utopia is precisely that movement towards a future that is dominant in the paradigm of modernity. And for me, I actually use hope as an alternative to using the word utopia, because it has a different temporality. Right? The utopia is future-oriented, and it is in this. It is bound to the very powerful logic of modernity, a dichotomy between immanence and transcendence, for those of you who are philosophers here. And so it is a form of the transcendental that will be a projection of what is in immanence. And for me, hope has not that temporality. For me, hope belongs to what I call the temporality of precedence, which is that past that is ahead of us, that is in Urdu, in Chinese, as we learned this morning, also in all the Mayan languages, in many languages from Mesoamerica, and from the whole of Abya Yala, the Americas, from the First Nations. You have this notion of precedence that is unlike the past for the West that is gone and fixed, but the notion of precedence tells you that it is that the time of the ancestral time is a time that is ahead of us. It is the before you. Right? It is in your face because it has happened. So it precedes you. Right? Like in a march, what precedes the march is what is going ahead. And this is a notion of time that cannot fit into the immanence transcendence that sustain the idea of utopia. But hope is always possible in this claim of justice that comes from precedence and that is moving us to do something, moving us to search for an ethical life, right? And this is where hope lies, not in a projection or an imagination of the future.
Thank you.
Yeah, that sounds really good. I agree. But I want to say, so I guess I put it in a more pedestrian way. I guess for me, there's hope with the big H and hope with the small h. And I think the sort of hope with the big H, I would link that to the relevant utopia. But I think that if we, as human beings, as activists, as artists, people who care, are not able to hope with a small h, then I think we are in a bad way. So when I look at for instance, when I think about the Iraqi feminists I talk about, of course, they, in terms of the aspirations, the utopia of addressing, getting rid of inequalities, whether they're linked to sectarianism, whether they're linked to class, whether they're linked to definitely gender in the Iraqi context. I mean, they know very well that that is something that is not tangible in the immediate future, definitely not in the present. And so their hopes are linked to small steps, right? Small aspirations, whether this is, getting some girls into school where the parents did not let them go into school. This is challenging, local politicians to try to criminalize gender-based violence. I mean, they're sort of small steps, and I think it is really important to have these small utopias or small, actually achievable gains to maintain hope. So I think that if you ask me the question the way you asked it, I think we would be in big trouble, if we were all sort of just thinking about the big inequalities. Of course, we need to. But in terms of the everyday hope, I think that doesn't work.
Thanks.
I like, in French, we make a difference between two words, espoir and espérance. And I like this difference because espoir, if you read Spinoza, this is what you were saying about utopia is just a projection in an outer world of imaginaries that are completely false. But the idea of espérance, is a theological one and a religious one. And what is interesting is that you find this idea of espérance in all the writings of Césaire. And Césaire says that, for example, you need hope, espérance, because espérance is synonym of praxis. And you need to change the world. You need this kind of espérance of hope just because it is effectively rooted in the past that you don't want to. But this past that you don't want to be repeated is also a past that bear all the acts of defense, resistance that will shape the way you want to change the world today. So I like this idea of espérance. And just to finish this question, I was very close to a black theologian that has just passed 1 month ago. I don't know if you have heard about Professor James Cone. And he was a black theologian, and he was teaching in the Union Theological Seminary, which is near Columbia, which is close to Columbia University. And I remember I listened to him once during a conference, and he was just talking about what faith was. And I think that his conception of faith is rooted in this idea of hope, which is very you have this in the liberation theology. And he was just saying that faith has nothing to do with God. And faith is what? It is just what maintains you alive when all the order of the world wants to destroy you. So I think that faith and hope are related because they are trying to define a kind of praxis in a world that wants to disintegrate you, as would say Bulaga.
Okay, and with that statement, should you have any questions for yourselves or topics that you'd like to elaborate on? I know that you had touched on the question about intersectional and decolonial positioning. I think that's something that we'd all be interested in hearing a bit about, but otherwise, after that, I'm going to open the floor for further questions. So if you can just briefly touch on that if you'd like to.
Okay. I was just still thinking on what you just said on faith. That's what keeps you alive under oppression, right? But this means that this. I'm just carrying on and then go to your question. And this means that this notion of hope is only possible if you don't forget, right? Whereas the power of modernity and this notion of utopia is precisely forgetfulness and futurity, right? So then the hope of the theologies of liberation is a hope that is grounded in the awareness of the suffering of others, which is how I started the ethical question. No? We cannot have a hope without forgetting, right? So the struggle, as I see the struggle of the decolonial and also decolonial artists, for example, and many First Nations movements, is first of all a struggle against oblivion, right? Against forgetting. And that is a source of hope. I mean, this is a very clear phrase that is used by the Zapatista movement in Mexico, that it is a war against oblivion, right? First, not first against capital or against the state or against many other things, but first is against oblivion, because remembering is a possibility of hope, right? Of knowing who you are. That's why I say of remembering ourselves, not in the singular, not in the I, but remember who we are as Earth and as peoples, right? Because we are made to forget when we fall in the traps of desire, of consumption, of individualism, of separation from Earth, all of that, right? So I think it's very important to show the politics of time that are at play, that are completely different in the notion of hope than in the notion of utopia, at least as it's commonly used.
Do you want to add something to that?
Sure. That's what you say is very important, because usually, for example, all the politics of memory that are rooted into a decolonial or even post-colonial tradition are undermined here and seen as politics of victimhood. The people who are remembering just want to be the people, the long-lasting suffering people having pathologies of the past and are not able to move forward. And that's why your discourse is important.
Yes. Let me carry on this as it is a conversation panel. If you want to? I'm actually just coming from the Middelburg Decolonial Summer School that we have been doing for the last 9 years. And this last week we had Professor John Casimir from the University of Haiti, and he puts such a strong emphasis in that this memory is not just the memory of victimhood, it's a memory of the possibility of survival under the worst conditions of inhumanity, right? Of deprivation, that were the conditions of the plantation economy, right? Where you have lost your name, your country, your land, your clothes, the possibility of speaking, and then how that survival creates very important, what the West will call technologies, but technologies of joy. Right? So how places like the Caribbean are powerhouses of the production of the joy of life in the face of adversity. Right? This is a thesis of Professor Casimir. And so I think it's so important to realize that remembering is not a conservative move, and is not a move towards museography or statues. Right? That is what some conservative movements in Europe do with the past, which is they congeal it into a fiction. But here, the past is alive, right? It is a precedence that informs the possibility of being different, because it gives you what is radically different from the order of oppression. And that means that you don't define yourself in the terms of oppression. You are not just resisting oppression, right, to capture the state or capture the market. You are defining yourself outside the logic of oppression. You are resisting it, but you are not just that resistance, right?
Yeah, just to add something. So, I mean, one of the challenges I've been experiencing in the context of Iraq and, you know, trying to unearth Iraqi history from the perspective of women. I mean, most of the histories are written sort of top down. Of course, a lot had to do, I mean, I'm an anthropologist, so my work was based on oral histories, and it was memories of suffering, inevitably, not just recent suffering in terms of the invasion, the occupation, sanctions, but also, you know, the 35 years of Baath regime. But I have to say, I found it really difficult and challenging to be a researcher and activist in a context where these memories obviously are very contested. And sometimes we're actually also challenged to not take narratives of the past at face value. So the way what I concretely, so in the Iraqi context, obviously contestations about the present in terms of access to resources, political legitimacy, is linked to suffering that different kinds of Iraqis have experienced under the previous regime. And so, you know, many Kurdish women would tell me, well, we were the only ones who suffered. And then some Shia women would say, no, it's not true. We are the only ones who suffered. And the Sunni opposition activists said, no, we were the only one. No, actually, they don't say we are the only one. But so in this context, you know, what is our role? Obviously, it's to listen, but I also felt it was my role to challenge. It was my role to challenge the memory of the, you know, either the Kurdish or Shia woman telling me, you know, they didn't suffer. It was only me who suffered. And then these kind of hierarchies of suffering created, you know, in order to make claims, political claims and economic claims.
Okay. And with that, I think I'm going to open the floor to extend the discussion and the conversation to the audience as well. Do we have any questions for our speakers? We have one in the middle over here.
Hi. First of all, thank you for all of this and the presentations. My question is mainly for Professor Alali. First of all, it's very interesting that you brought in the Middle East. I mean, neo-imperialism and colonialism did land there too. My question goes back to what are your views on the Egyptian feminists that you quoted, namely that in today's context, as the post-colonial Middle East, we don't actually need Western feminism or Western contributions. And keeping in mind what you mentioned in your presentation earlier about cultural purity, is there such a thing as a culturally pure Egyptian or Middle Eastern feminism? Also, can't Western frameworks such as, for example, intersectionality or affect theory or even Marxism prove to be very helpful in the Middle Eastern context without importing like colonial discursive violence in the process? Thank you.
Are we quiet or shall I? Think yeah. Yeah, thank you very much, because I mean, if this is what came across, I certainly do not want to suggest that there is purity. I actually don't believe anymore that there is such thing as Western feminism anyway. I mean, it's so diverse. No, what I was trying to say is that, I mean, feminists in the Middle East are being accused by all kinds of different constituencies in the region, including leftist men, of imitating the West, right? I mean, no one ever tells an Egyptian leftist, oh, you are following Marx and he's Westerner. That's never the problem. It's only with feminism that it's a problem. But the point that I wanted to make is that, in terms of that there is nothing inherent Western about feminism, that women in the region, whether in Iraq or in Egypt, have a history of feminism that emerged out of their experiences, in many contexts, of course, it was anti-colonial movements that also gave rise to feminist struggle, right? Now, a lot has changed between the 90s and now. So in the 90s, when I was in Egypt, I think especially the generation of feminists that grew out of the student movement in the 70s and so on, they were very much sort of trying to prove their authenticity as Egyptian feminists, as Middle East feminists. What I find really very inspiring and refreshing about the young generations of feminists in Egypt and elsewhere in the region is I feel they don't have that chip on their shoulders so much anymore. And everywhere in the region you have young feminists and also older who are translating texts into Arabic, who are aware of literature and also exchanging literature regionally. So when I was speaking about gender studies in the Iraqi context, it was, of course, Palestinian, Lebanese, Turkish, Egyptian female academics have a long history now of teaching gender studies, and their gender studies is very closely linked to local feminist struggles. And so I, very much believe, anyway, that we cannot speak of a Western feminism anymore. I mean, when we think about the big names, we're all sort of diasporic. And also when you think, though, many feminist theorists in the region are people who sort of move back and forth. And so, yeah, I think it's a very important question. Thank you.
We have two more questions, one over here and one... I think the lady behind you came first. Okay. And then yourself.
Ja. Ich heiße Mina Kani, ich bin iranische Publizistin, Feministin. Es ist schon ein bisschen verblüffend, dass ich hier anfange, Deutsch zu reden, weil das ist aber bei uns so eine Klassenfrage, wer Englisch kann, wer Deutsch kann. Deswegen würde mich freuen, wenn auch eine Möglichkeit für andere Sprachige gibt, hier zu übersetzen und so weiter und so fort. Meine Frage ist vor allem an Nadia Yala gerichtet. Was denkst du, was die Verbindung ist zwischen, also du hast ja über Imperialismus und die Rolle der imperialistischen Mächten halt auch im Middle East gesprochen und auch gleichzeitig von Feminismus und dass wir auch eine Geschichte von Feminismus haben. Das kennen wir Iraner aus der Zeit der Revolution 1979 und meine Frage ist, was ist die Verbindung zwischen unserer jetzigen Situation, die Situation der Frauen zum Beispiel im Iran, was das halt auch, die da halt auch sehr instrumentalisiert wird, momentan auch für westliche Politik und so weiter und so fort. Aber was ist die Verbindung zwischen unserer Situation als Feministinnen, als Frauen, die auch sehr miserabel ist in diesen Ländern, wofür wir auch teilweise fliehen, zu der Niederlage unserer Revolutionen, unserer progressiven Kräften, die halt auch klar damit zu tun hat, dass auch die imperialen Mächte auch in diesen Ländern so intervenieren, wie sie intervenieren. Also 1979, Iran, hatten wir eine Revolution, Frauen waren sehr stark dabei, waren auch die ersten Kräfte, die gegen Khomeini auf der Straße gegangen sind. 1980 wurde Iran vom Irak mit der Unterstützung von Amerikanern angegriffen. 8 Jahre lang hat der Krieg gedauert. Zwischendurch gab es Säuberungen, Massakern, Frauenunterdrückung wurde so stark strukturalisiert und so weiter und so fort. Und natürlich gibt es eine klare Verbindung. Ich komme aus der Zeit, ich bin ein Kind dieses Krieges. Meine ersten Erinnerungen sind Iran-Irak-Krieg. Und meine Mutter musste Kopftuch tragen als irgendwelche Revolutionsgarden während des Krieges. Vor ihr standen und haben gesagt, Schwester, entweder trägst du jetzt das Kopftuch oder wir knallen. 1 Million Tote, Halabja, Kurdistan und so weiter und so fort. Das alles hat miteinander zu tun und mein Problem ist, wir reden immer in einem Kontext von Anti-Imperialismus und dann halt auch die Situation und die ganze krasse Entwicklungen in sogenannte dritte Welt, als ob die was Getrenntes sind und irgendwie irgendwo dazu, keine Ahnung, irgendwie irgendeiner unmittelbare Verbindung zueinander finden irgendwo. Aber das ist für mich, die Verbindung ist permanent. Also meine Geschichte, warum iranische Feministinnen zum Beispiel 1979 niedergeschlagen wurden, hat unmittelbar mit der Intervention der USA im Iran nach der Revolution was zu tun. Ich wollte deine Meinung dazu wissen.
Okay, I'm trying to translate.
Okay, will you summarize it? Or?
Do you want?
Feel free.
Yeah. So I'll try to. Okay. So I understood that. I mean, it's more a comment than a question, but I'm asked to reflect on this. The question. Okay, so I've mentioned imperialism, but how the revolution particularly, so I should say, so it's about Iran and the revolution 1979, the link between the failure of the revolution as in the progressive, I mean, feminist women were very much part of the revolution, the Verbindung, the relation, the relation between the failed revolution and the situation of women in Iran. So I'm not quite sure that I really, got it. I mean, obviously, I agree that the situation in Iran of women in Iran is linked to the failure of the revolution. I don't know exactly what it is that you asked me actually to comment on because, okay, so you mentioned the Iran-Iraq war. Yeah.
Ich habe sehr oft das Problem, dass diese zwei Diskussionen voneinander getrennt werden.
Ja, okay.
Als ob ein imperialen Einfluss auf diese Länder gibt, die gar keine Verbindung zu der Entwicklung unserer progressiven Kräfte in diesen Ländern hat. Ist nicht das, was du gesagt hast, aber ich möchte gerne, dass man darüber redet.
Yeah, okay. So so now, okay, so the relationship between the, imperialist policies and the failure of progressive forces in countries in the region. Yeah? Yeah, okay. Yeah, obviously. I mean, that is very much the case. The point that I was trying to make, I mean, that's the kind of starting point, but when I write about, so I mean, obviously I didn't speak about Iran, but in the Iraqi context, yes, of course, the failure of progressive constituencies is linked to imperialist policies. But, and this is where, I sort of moved away from what I was sort of arguing maybe 5 years ago, I don't think it can be reduced to it or conflated. So there are other factors that play a role as well. And this is where I feel that sometimes, and this goes back to positionality. Of course, if you're based in Berlin or if you're based in London, I mean, I would assume that our sort of immediate political responsibility and also, who is listening to us are governments. It's the German government, the British government, the US government. Clearly, then, that will influence our political activism, engagement, and language and discourse, okay? But I think it is problematic if we do this at the expense of glossing over local and regional complicities and agencies. So yes, I mean, the situation of women in Iran, clearly we need to link directly to US imperialism, but it cannot be reduced to US imperialism.
Thank you, Nadja. We have one more question. We've got... Okay, so it looks like we've got 3 more questions. I'm going to ask you to pose your questions briefly and succinctly, and I'm going to ask you to respond to them likewise. Okay.
Yeah, I will make this brief. Thank you very much for 3 very inspiring presentations. I was struck by how all 3 presentations also implicitly addressed the idea of how home space is being constructed. And I was wondering if you could perhaps address how your readings of hope can actually sort of speak to this idea of creating home spaces, again, sort of making that link towards forms of belonging and citizenship. We have Iraqi women actively being involved with forms of feminist activism, so where feminism is then seen as a problem, but that still contributes to shaping a home space. We have the depletion of the Earth's resources. We have a planetary home space that we need to think about. We're talking about the occupation of a Parisian university by refugees, and that particular educational institution has also been opened up as a space by faculty and students. So we have migratory searches for home as well. So perhaps you could speak to how hope is instrumental in our perceptions and constructions of home.
Okay, the mic is going to travel to the gentleman over there.
Hello, my name is Donal, and thank you for all your time today. So during the talks, I noticed a lot of talk about the colonial past in history, that the moving on from colonialism, and the use of the term post-colonial as well, of course. Just a thought, do you think it's possible to think like this in a way that we've moved beyond colonialism when debatably it's still taking place in the Middle East, that there is an example of colonialism in the present day, for example, in Israel or Palestine, and how would you consider that?
Hi, thank you for your amazing talk. My name is Daniel. I've got a question towards Nadje. Thank you for your amazing lecture. I really enjoyed it, more specifically the part of Middle Eastern feminism combined with anti-colonial positionality. What I noticed is that when we talk about Middle Eastern feminism, most of the times our views contain to Egypt, Palestine, Iraq, and so on, and most of the time Israel is excluded, and I find it quite interesting to combine those approaches into a transnational feminism throughout Middle Eastern. So I would like to know, what do you think, how is the positionality at the moment in order to combine a feminism that is neither racist against Muslims and neither racist against Jewish people throughout the Middle Eastern?
So can you just repeat the last bit? I mean, your question, actually, the last question. Yeah.
How do you see the feminist movement in the Middle East?
Yeah.
My question is because I've worked and lived in Israel, and therefore I've noticed different feminist movements in the country. Most of the time, those movements were feminist, but also, or even though they were feminists, most of the time those feminist debates concentrated on the Middle Eastern conflict. And I would like to know, how do you see the situation in the Middle East, the feminist discussion? Is it focused, from your perspective, on the Israel-Palestine conflict, and more specifically, can you discover a feminism that is unifying or uniting either Jewish and Muslim people, and what approach would you consider?
We have 2 questions which are addressed to you and which basically touch on a similar issue, right? If you would like to start with the response, and then we'd get the responses from Rolando and Yala, considering the first question.
You want me to start?
If you wouldn't mind.
Okay, so, I mean, you know, post-colonial doesn't mean not colonial. I mean, I think there's a sort of maybe misconception that we are sort of, certainly not just in the context of Israel-Palestine, but in the context of Iraq, you know, I can't speak about post-colonial as in not neo-colonial. I mean, there's definitely colonization going on, and in Israel there's settler colonialism going on. Now, in terms of the question of Israel-Palestine and the possibility for transnational feminism, so I'm personally involved in a group called Women in Black in London, and Women in Black actually started in Israel-Palestine by a group of Palestinian and Israeli women who were able to get together because they were not only focusing on gender-based violence, but they were also jointly struggling against the specific policies of the Israeli state vis-à-vis Palestinians. And I've been over the years involved in many initiatives that actually involve you know, Jewish, Israeli, and Palestinian women, whether they are 48ers, so you know, Palestinian women with Israeli passports or Palestinian women from the occupied territories. And there were moments in the sort of recent history of Israel-Palestine where it was more possible, where, you know, the kind of political, general political situation, especially in, I guess, in the initial post-Oslo period, you know, it was more hopeful and people were coming together. But certainly many of the Palestinian women started in many initiatives to get disillusioned with some of these initiatives because they felt that they were asked to be sisterly on the basis of patriarchy, experiencing patriarchy together, experiencing different forms of gender-based violence. But the Palestinian women wanted, you know, their Israeli sisters to be intersectional in their approach and to recognize that the different forms of oppression they were experiencing wasn't just because of patriarchy in some abstract term, but they were very much linked to, you know, Israeli policies as well, and they needed that recognition in order to be able to work with them. And there are some, I know that there are some Israeli feminists who are the most outspoken critics of the Israeli government, and they are the ones that are still able to work, you know, with Palestinian women. And of course, in the context of feminism in the region more broadly, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is very much at the center of many debates, definitely.
Would you like to address the first question?
The last question.
About the home space?
Okay, yes, for us, thank you for bringing this question of home. How we will place it, we will think of it through the concept of, or the verb, inhabiting. So we'll make it into a verbality and not a name, a noun. So home is not a space you buy, right? It is a verbality, and in being a verbality, it already carries these temporalities we were speaking about. So it implies a caring for, it implies an embodiment, it implies a recognition, not just of the people that can inhabit and care for each other and create a home, but also of the space in which you are as what many people will call as an ancestral place, as a place that has time, right, that carries memories, and that you are caring for that place as well. So space cannot be reduced to a commodity, and the availability of home cannot be reduced to property. So home, in the sense of inhabiting, has to have this practice of what I've been calling relational temporalities.
Yeah, this question of hope and home, I think, is really important. I will make two short answers. The first one, very practical. There is a large movement in the in the youth Afropean, I should say, like the writer Leonora Miano says, Afro-European diaspora. There are a lot of movements now of young people born in Europe sometimes that want to return back to Africa. So you have this big tradition of returning back that is rooted in a long history of the African, Black African diaspora. And it is really interesting to see how they understand the question of going back home. It's not a question, it can be, of course, but it's not exclusively a question of cultural or traditions. It's also a political fact and a political act saying that we are in a situation that is really conflictual between the way we live here and how the way we live here is sustained and is need the kind of, okay, it's going to be quite massive, but needs the exploitation of what is over there. So the returning back home is seen as a political gesture. And the second answer is that what is interesting in what you say is that we have had a very idealization, especially in philosophy, of the figure of the migrant and seen as a kind of embodiment of a new cosmopolitical area or something very romantic. And what I like with your question, it is that it shows how migration, especially forced migration of the people who are migrants or refugees, is just something that says that we should perhaps, in a non-conservative way, to try to redefine what is a territory. And I think we need a territory, not a home, a territory. This is a very horrible world, I know, but territory just means that you need a place where you can sustain and nurture your own existence. So, not home, but territory.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank the speakers and the audience for engaging us on this topic that we've called hope. I think what came to light is that hope is complicated in this dialogue, and I'm sure you can all share that opinion with me. But it is the essence of transformation, and that is something I think that we all hope to espouse in some way or the other. Nikita would like to say something in terms of closing, and thank you very much for being here today.
I too would like to thank the audience, the speakers, the moderators for this wonderfully inspiring day. As a curator of this event, I don't think I could have wished for a better performance, if I may use the opposite of non-performance, from all of you all who have participated today. I will repeat the 3 organizational announcements with which I started the day. Firstly, very important, tomorrow's session will not be held here, but at the other venue of the Akademie der Künste, namely at the Hanseatenweg 10. Please note that we only have seating for 700 people, so it will be on first-come, first-served basis. The event will be live streams. The tickets will be available from 10:30 onwards. And lastly, there is a slight change for the first panel tomorrow. Rahul Rao has very kindly agreed at the last moment to jump in, so he will be contributing as a speaker to the panel, and I'll be moderating. I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow. Have a wonderful evening.